The explosion was heard in St. Paul, 10 miles away. It shattered windows 3 blocks from the blast site and sent a mushroom cloud of flame and debris 200 feet into the air. It destroyed the largest flour mill in the United States and killed 18 men instantly, some of them vaporized by the pressure wave, others crushed when the 7-story building collapsed inward. And it was caused by flour. Not dynamite, not a boiler explosion, not sabotage. Flour dust. The fine powder that coats every surface in a working mill, that hangs in the air like mist, that seems harmless until you understand that suspended in the right concentration with the right ignition source, it detonates with a force comparable to black powder. On the evening of May 2, 1878, the Washburn A mill in Minneapolis, the pride of the city's booming milling industry, the largest flour producer in the country, became a bomb. At 7:15 in the evening, with 18 men working the shift, an ignition source, probably a spark from the grinding millstones, met a cloud of suspended flour dust. The resulting deflagration consumed the building in seconds. The pressure wave blew out the walls, the structure collapsed, and the debris from the explosion, fragments of timber and stone and machinery, rained down on the neighboring mills, igniting secondary explosions that destroyed 3 more buildings and killed 5 more men. By the time the fires were controlled, 23 men were dead, and the heart of Minneapolis's economy was rubble. This is the story of the Washburn A mill disaster. How flour dust became a weapon, how the explosion unfolded, how the city responded, and how an industry that knew dust was dangerous chose profit over safety until the inevitable happened. Let's start with the mill itself, because understanding what was destroyed helps you understand the scale of the catastrophe. The Washburn A mill stood on the west bank of the Mississippi River at St. Anthony Falls, the only significant waterfall on the Mississippi, the power source that had made Minneapolis a milling center. The falls provided water power. Mills built along the riverbank harnessed the flow with turbines, driving the machinery that ground wheat into flour. By the 1870s, Minneapolis was the flour milling capital of the United States, processing wheat from the vast farms of Minnesota and the Dakotas, shipping flour east by rail and south by river. The Washburn A was the crown jewel of this industry. Built in 1874 by Cadwallader Washburn, a miller and entrepreneur who would later co-found General Mills, the Washburn A was a technological marvel. It was 7 stories tall, built of limestone and timber, with a footprint of roughly 50 by 100 feet. It was equipped with the latest milling technology, including middlings purifiers, machines that separated the wheat endosperm from the bran more efficiently than traditional methods. This allowed the production of high-quality white flour, a premium product that commanded premium prices. The mill's capacity was enormous. At full production, the Washburn A could process 1,500 barrels of flour per day. A barrel of flour in that era was 196 pounds. 1,500 barrels meant nearly 300,000 pounds of flour daily. The machinery required to achieve this output was extensive. The mill contained dozens of grinding stones, massive circular stones that rotated against each other, crushing the wheat. The ground wheat was moved between floors by elevators, conveyor belts driven by leather belts and pulleys, all powered by the turbines in the basement. The wheat came in, was cleaned, ground, sifted, purified, and bagged, all within the same building. And every step of that process generated dust. Flour dust. Fine particles of wheat starch and protein, ground so fine they became airborne at the slightest disturbance. The dust coated everything: the floors, the walls, the beams, the machinery. It hung in the air, illuminated in the shafts of light from the windows, a constant presence that the workers breathed, that settled on their clothes, that seemed an unavoidable byproduct of the milling process. The workers knew it was flammable. There had been small fires, flash fires, when dust near a lantern or a hot bearing ignited and burned quickly, singeing eyebrows and filling the room with smoke, but not causing serious damage. Dust fires were considered a nuisance, not a threat. What the workers didn't fully understand, what the company didn't adequately communicate, or perhaps didn't fully grasp itself, was that under the right conditions, flour dust didn't just burn, it exploded. May 2nd, 1878 was a normal day at the Washburn A. The mill operated around the clock, 3 shifts, keeping the machinery running continuously to maximize output. The evening shift began at 6 p.m. 18 men reported for work. Most were millers, skilled workers who operated the grinding stones and the purifiers. Others were laborers, men who handled the bags of flour, moved grain, cleaned equipment. The shift supervisor was George Christian, an experienced miller who had worked at the Washburn A since it opened. Among the crew were men with families, men in their 20s and 30s, immigrants and native-born Americans, all drawn to Minneapolis by the booming milling industry and the wages it offered. By 7 p.m., the mill was running smoothly. The grinding stones were turning, the wheat was flowing through the system, and the dust was accumulating as it always did. There was nothing unusual, no mechanical failure, no warning sign. Just the routine operation of a flour mill on a spring evening. At approximately 7:10 p.m., something changed. We don't know exactly what. The investigation that followed could only reconstruct probabilities. But somewhere in the mill, likely in one of the grinding rooms, a spark was generated. It could have been from the millstones. The stones, rotating against each other under immense pressure, grinding wheat, could strike a piece of metal, a fragment of debris that had gotten into the grain, and produce a spark. It could have been from a bearing. The machinery was old, the bearings were friction-based, and a bearing running dry or misaligned could heat up, could glow red, could ignite dust in contact with it. It could have been static electricity, a discharge in the dry air of the mill. Whatever the source, a spark met a cloud of suspended flour dust, and the physics of dust explosions took over. Flour dust, when suspended in air at the right concentration, is explosive. The key word is suspended. Dust lying on a surface burns but doesn't explode. Dust suspended in the air, with each particle surrounded by oxygen, with enough space between particles for flame to propagate, behaves differently. When ignited, the flame spreads from particle to particle, almost instantaneously, faster than the speed of sound in some cases, creating a deflagration. A deflagration is not a detonation, not a shock wave, but it's close. It's a very rapid combustion that generates heat and pressure. In a confined space, a building, the pressure has nowhere to go. It builds in milliseconds, exceeding the structural capacity of the walls and the roof. The building explodes from the inside out. That's what happened to the Washburn A. At 7:15 p.m., the initial ignition occurred. A small flame, a flash, in one of the grinding rooms. The flame propagated through the suspended dust cloud. The combustion generated heat over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit instantaneously. The heat expanded the air, creating pressure. The pressure wave moved outward, faster than the flame, reaching the walls of the building. The walls, stone and timber, were strong, but not designed to resist internal pressure. The pressure exceeded their capacity. The walls blew out. The roof lifted and disintegrated. The floors, no longer supported, collapsed inward, pancaking down on each other. The sound was described by witnesses as a deep, concussive boom. Not a sharp crack, but a rolling thunder that shook the ground. People 3 blocks away felt the concussion, felt the air pressure change, felt the vibration through their feet. The light was described as a flash, a brilliant orange-yellow light that lit up the evening sky, visible for miles. One witness, a worker at a neighboring mill, said it looked like the sun had risen for a moment and then gone out. The mushroom cloud, the column of flame and debris that rose above the ruins, was visible from St. Paul. People in the streets stopped and stared, trying to understand what they were seeing. The debris field was extensive. Fragments of the building, timbers, stones, pieces of machinery were thrown hundreds of feet. A grinding stone, weighing over a ton, was found 2 blocks away. Pieces of timber, some still burning, rained down on the neighboring mills and on the residential areas nearby. The workers inside the Washburn A had no warning. One moment they were working, the next they were in the center of an explosion. The pressure wave killed most of them instantly. The human body cannot withstand the kind of pressure differential generated by a deflagration in a confined space. Eardrums rupture, lungs collapse, blood vessels burst. The heat, 3,000 degrees, incinerated anything organic in the immediate vicinity. And then the building collapsed. 7 stories of stone and timber crashing down, burying anyone who had survived the initial blast. Of the 18 men inside, none walked out. Some were killed by the pressure. Some were burned. Some were crushed. Some were all three. But the Washburn A explosion was only the beginning. The debris from the blast, burning timber and flaming fragments, spread across the milling district. The mills were built close together, separated by narrow lanes, sharing the riverbank for access to the water power. The diamond mill, directly adjacent to the Washburn A, was struck by debris. Fire broke out in the upper floors. The fire spread to the stored grain and flour. Within minutes, the dust in the diamond mill ignited. A second explosion, smaller than the first but still devastating, destroyed the diamond mill. 3 men working inside were killed. The Humboldt Mill, further down the riverbank, was also struck by debris. It too caught fire. It too exploded. 2 more men dead. The Galaxy Mill was damaged but evacuated in time. The workers, hearing the first explosion, seeing the fires, ran. The Zenith Mill, at the far end of the district, was threatened but survived. In total, 5 major mill structures were destroyed or heavily damaged in the span of 20 minutes. The fires burned through the night. The mills, full of grain and flour, burned hot and fast. The timber framing, the wooden floors and walls, fed the flames. The stone walls, heated to extreme temperatures, cracked and collapsed. By dawn, the Washburn A was a smoking crater. The walls had fallen inward. The machinery was twisted scrap. The only recognizable feature was the foundation, the stone base that had supported the building, now exposed and scorched. The rescue efforts began immediately, but they were exercises in futility. Men from the neighboring mills, firefighters from Minneapolis, volunteers from the community, they rushed to the scene, but there was nothing to rescue. The fires were too hot to approach. The rubble was unstable, shifting, collapsing further as the remaining structure cooled and contracted. The initial efforts focused on containing the fires, preventing them from spreading to the remaining mills and to the residential areas. Water was pumped from the river. Firefighters worked through the night, soaking the ruins, creating fire breaks. By morning, the fires were controlled, and the grim work of recovery began. The rubble was searched systematically, crews moving carefully through the debris, looking for bodies. What they found was fragmentary. The explosion and the collapse and the fire had destroyed most of the remains. Partial bodies were recovered, identified by clothing or personal effects when possible. Some men were identified by wedding rings, by tools they carried, by the testimony of co-workers who knew where each man had been working. Of the 18 men known to be inside the Washburn A, the remains of 14 were eventually recovered. 4 were never found. They were presumed vaporized by the initial blast or buried so deeply in the rubble that recovery was impossible. The families of the dead gathered at the site, waiting for news, hoping against evidence that their husbands, fathers, sons might have survived. The city was in shock, grieving, trying to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The investigation began within days. The city and state governments, the insurance companies, and the milling industry itself all wanted to know what had happened and why. A commission was formed, led by engineers and fire safety experts. They examined the ruins, interviewed survivors from the neighboring mills, studied the design and operation of the Washburn A, and reviewed the existing literature on industrial explosions. The conclusion was unambiguous. The explosion was caused by the ignition of suspended flour dust. The Commission's report, published in August of 1878, detailed the mechanics of dust explosions, cited previous incidents in Europe and the eastern United States, and noted that the dangers of flour dust had been known to the industry for years. This is where the story becomes darker. The Commission found that the conditions in the Washburn A were conducive to a dust explosion. The ventilation was inadequate. The dust accumulation was excessive. The ignition sources were uncontrolled, and the company had been warned. There were records of consultations with engineers who had recommended improved ventilation. There were insurance reports that had noted the dust hazard. There were accounts from workers who had complained about the dust and the small fires, and the company had done minimal response. The cost of installing adequate ventilation, of redesigning the airflow, of implementing rigorous cleaning schedules was deemed too high. The risk was acknowledged, but accepted. The calculation, never stated explicitly, but evident in the actions, was that the cost of prevention exceeded the expected cost of a disaster, which was assumed to be property damage and perhaps a few injuries, not 23 deaths and the total destruction of the facility. There were no criminal charges. The law at the time did not provide for corporate manslaughter. There was no regulatory framework that could hold the company accountable. There were civil lawsuits, families of the dead suing for compensation, but the amounts awarded were minimal by any standard. A few $1,000s per family, enough to bury the dead and perhaps survive a few months, but not remotely commensurate with the loss. The company, Washburn and his partners, expressed regret and pledged to rebuild safer. And they did. The Washburn A was reopened in 1880 as the Washburn A Mill, rebuilt with fireproof construction, steel framing instead of timber, concrete floors instead of wood, and critically, with dust collection and ventilation systems designed to prevent the accumulation of explosive dust clouds. The new mill became a model for the industry. Other mills, in Minneapolis and across the country, implemented similar changes. Dust collection systems, explosion venting panels that would blow out in the event of an explosion to relieve pressure, fireproof construction, operational procedures that required regular cleaning and monitoring. The changes were gradual and uneven. Some mills adopted the new standards quickly. Others resisted, citing cost, until insurance companies refused to cover mills that didn't meet minimum safety standards. The industry transformed, slowly, over decades, driven not by regulation, which was weak or non-existent, but by insurance economics and the threat of total loss. But the lessons were not universally learned. Dust explosions continued. In 1886, a grain elevator in Minneapolis exploded, killing 7. In 1904, a flour mill in New York exploded, killing 20. In 1916, a grain elevator in Buffalo exploded, killing dozens. Each explosion prompted renewed attention, renewed calls for safety standards, renewed industry promises to do better. And each explosion was followed by a period of complacency until the next disaster. The worst grain dust explosion in U.S. history occurred in 1977 at the Continental Grain Elevator in Westwego, Louisiana. 36 men were killed when a series of grain dust explosions destroyed the facility. Nearly a century after the Washburn A, the same physics, the same failure to control dust, the same preventable disaster. Federal regulations, OSHA standards for combustible dust, were eventually implemented in the wake of Westwego and subsequent disasters. But the regulations are reactive, written in response to disasters, not proactive. The physics of dust explosions are unchanged. Flour, grain, sugar, coal, wood, metal, any combustible material ground fine enough, suspended in air, will explode if ignited. The conditions are common in industrial settings. The prevention requires vigilance, investment, and a willingness to prioritize safety over short-term cost savings. The failure to do so is predictable, and the results are catastrophic. What remains of the Washburn A today is memory and stone. The site of the original mill, on the west bank of the Mississippi at St. Anthony Falls, is now part of the Mill City Museum, a museum dedicated to the history of Minneapolis milling. The museum is built into the ruins of the Washburn A mill, the 1880 rebuilt version, which itself was destroyed by fire in 1991. You can walk through the ruins, see the limestone walls, the arches, the foundations. Interpretive displays tell the story of the industry, the technology, the people. And they tell the story of May 2nd, 1878, the explosion, the deaths, the lessons learned and forgotten and relearned. The names of the 18 men killed in the Washburn A are listed. George Christian, the shift supervisor, 38 years old, married, 3 children. John McCarthy, miller, 26 years old, immigrant from Ireland. Henry Johnson, laborer, 22 years old. The list continues. 18 names, 18 lives, ended in an instant because flour dust, the byproduct of making bread, became a bomb. The city of Minneapolis recovered and grew. The milling industry rebuilt and thrived, eventually declining as milling shifted closer to wheat production areas and as corporate consolidation centralized production. But for a time, Minneapolis was the flour capital of the world, and that status was built on the labor and the lives of men who worked in conditions that we would recognize today as unconscionable. The Washburn A disaster is a story of known risk and accepted cost. The company knew dust was dangerous. The industry knew. The experts knew. And the decision was made, implicitly, that the cost of prevention was not justified by the risk of disaster. That calculation held until the disaster occurred, and then it was revised and safety improved until complacency set in and the cycle repeated. This pattern, disaster, reform, complacency, repeat, is a recurring theme in industrial history. We learn the lessons in blood and then forget them when the blood has been washed away and the pressure to cut costs returns. The flour dust explosion that destroyed the Washburn A killed 23 men, destroyed 5 buildings, and shocked a city. It led to industry changes that saved countless lives. But the changes were incomplete, and the lessons were imperfectly learned. Dust explosions still happen. Workers still die. The physics are unchanged, and the human tendency to prioritize short-term gain over long-term safety is unchanged. So here's to the 18 men who died in the Washburn A, and the 5 who died in the neighboring mills, and the thousands who have died in dust explosions before and since. Here's to George Christian, and John McCarthy, and Henry Johnson, and the others whose names are listed in the Mill City Museum. Here's to the men who went to work on a May evening in 1878, expecting a routine shift, and were killed by an explosion they didn't understand and couldn't have prevented. Here's to the families who lost fathers and husbands and sons and received minimal compensation and no justice. And here's to the lesson, written in ash and stone and blood, that flour dust explodes, that prevention is possible, and that the cost of safety is always less than the cost of disaster. We've learned that lesson. We forget it, we relearn it, and the cycle continues. The Washburn A stands in ruins and memory as a monument to the cost of forgetting.